New Guinea, August 1943. The dense jungle presses in, thick and unforgiving. The air is heavy with moisture. The ground beneath is a mire of mud, broken only by towering trees and tangled vine. A steady hum of insects fills the silence. The Japanese soldiers crouch low, eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon through the fog. They have heard rumors, but what they see now is beyond comprehension. Ahead of them, in the thickest part of the jungle, American soldiers are doing the impossible. U.S. Army engineers, drenched in sweat, machetes in hand, hack through the foliage at an astonishing pace. The Japanese had believed this terrain was impassable, an unbreakable barrier that would halt any military advance. But these Americans, in uniform and boots that sink into the earth with each step, are building a road. The air is punctuated by the sound of bulldozers roaring to life, crushing through the underbrush with mechanical precision. Trucks carrying supplies, troops, and artillery begin to rumble across the freshly made path. A Japanese officer watches from a hilltop, his mouth agape. They're building roads. Through the jungle, it is not just a road, it is a new way forward. A new way to win. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific War had shifted dramatically. The Japanese Empire, once basking in the glory of its early conquest, now found itself on the defensive. The United States, having learned from its initial failures and built a formidable war machine, was pushing back. With each passing month, the tide turned further in favor of the Allies. But the Pacific theater presented unique challenges that tested both American ingenuity and endurance. The dense jungles of New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands formed a natural barrier. For the Japanese, they were the ideal defense. The heavy foliage and impenetrable terrain not only provided concealment for troops, but also limited supply and artillery movement. To the Japanese high command, this geographical advantage was seen as a key part of their defense strategy. Their defensive lines, entrenched deep within the jungles, were seen as almost unbreachable, as shield against any advancing army. At the same time, the Japanese military struggled with the very logistics that their defensive lines relied on. The jungles they had hoped would be their stronghold had become their Achilles heel. Supply lines were long, difficult to maintain, and often cut off by Allied naval and air superiority. The Japanese forces, isolated in the jungle, found themselves slowly starving, their artillery running low on ammunition, and reinforcements increasingly difficult to send. The Americans, however, approached this environment with a different philosophy. U.S. military engineers had long been familiar with the need for mobility in warfare. The Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalion, had already earned a reputation for constructing airstrips on remote Pacific islands. But what they were about to face in New Guinea was a challenge on a scale they had never encountered. The Japanese had believed that the thick, swampy, mountainous regions of the Pacific could not support roads, at least not roads that could withstand the movement of heavy military equipment. The terrain seemed to be a natural ally of Japan's defensive strategy for the American. However, it was an obstacle to be conquered. In early 1943, the American High Command launched the Solomon Islands Campaign, a series of land, sea, and air battles designed to clear the Japanese from key positions and create staging grounds for future attacks on the Philippines and the Japanese home islands. New Guinea, with its swamps and mountains, was a critical point on the strategic map. The U.S. needed to establish supply routes to keep their advancing troops supplied, and to transport the artillery, tanks, and air support necessary to push the Japanese from the island. The Japanese, confident that no one could build roads through the seemingly impossible terrain, underestimated the ingenuity of American engineers. U.S. forces quickly began to demonstrate their belief in the power of logistics. They understood that without roads, without transportation lines, victory would be delayed and could eventually be lost. The ability to move artillery, tanks, supplies, and reinforcements into the heart of enemy territory could tilt the balance of power. And so began a series of engineering feats that would forever change the course of the war in the Pacific. Despite every natural barrier the jungle threw in their path, the American engineers built roads through swamps, across mountains, and over rivers. Where the Japanese saw impenetrable obstacles, the Americans saw opportunities, and they would not be denied. What began as a trickle soon turned into an unstoppable force. As the Pacific Campaign raged on, the ability to rapidly build roads through the dense jungles of islands like New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Leyte became the linchpin for American success. Where the Japanese relied on the seemingly unassailable nature of the terrain to protect their forces, the Americans quickly realized that they could turn this very landscape into a highway to victory. The first major test came in Guadalcanal, where U.S. forces fought bitterly to capture and hold the island. After the pivotal Battle of the Tanaru in early August 1942, the Japanese attempted to cut off American forces by controlling the island's interior. In response, American engineers built a road through the rugged jungle, linking the U.S. base at Henderson Field with critical supply depots. This was no simple feat. No mechanized equipment had ever been used to build a road through such terrain. But the U.S. engineers did the impossible. They used bulldozers and dynamite to clear the thick underbrush and jungle growth. Bridges were constructed over the countless streams and ravines that pocked the land. As American forces in the area continued to fight, the engineers worked day and night, carving through the forest to bring critical supplies into American hands. Their success was not just about logistics, it was about a revolution in warfare. They demonstrated that infrastructure could be a weapon. In New Guinea, the stakes were even higher. The Japanese believed the island was unconquerable, its interior too treacherous for a sustained attack. They had turned the thick jungles into a fortress that could only be reached by narrow trails, many of which were too steep for even infantry to traverse without difficulty. To the Japanese, these natural barriers were an advantage they could exploit against an American force that would be forced to fight through impassable swamps and dense tropical terrain. But the Americans, with their Seabees and Army engineers, approached the challenge differently. They didn't just accept the jungle as a natural enemy, they fought it. Armed with bulldozers, explosives, and a single-minded determination, American engineers began the Herculean task of carving all-weather roads through the swamps and mountains. The Guadalcanal causeways became one of the most famous examples of American ingenuity. Hundreds of miles of raised roadbed through swampy terrain, built under fire, with no heavy machinery and little time. The causeways were nothing short of miraculous. They connected key U.S. positions, allowing troops, tanks, and supplies to move from one side of the island to the other over terrain that should have been impassable. American engineers not only overcame the physical obstacles but adapted to every challenge the jungle presented. They created corduroy roads, made of logs laid across soft terrain, to allow vehicles to pass through swamps. They built floating bridges over rivers and used pontoon bridges when crossing larger bodies of water. At every step, they used their knowledge, innovation, and sheer willpower to make roads where none existed. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no comparable engineering force. Though they had built fortifications and rudimentary roads in the Pacific, their resources and manpower were severely strained by war on multiple fronts. As the American engineers cut through the jungles and built the necessary infrastructure to support the war effort, the Japanese realized too late that the Americans were not only capable of sustained offensive warfare, but of building the logistical networks that powered it. One of the most symbolic events took place on Leyte in late 1944. As American forces landed on the island in October, their first major challenge was not just fighting the Japanese forces, but making sure their troops had the necessary supplies and reinforcements. Once again, the engineers got to work, carving roads through thick jungle and connecting critical points to enable the rapid movement of troops and supplies. Within 2 weeks, these roads enabled American forces to land supplies, transport vehicles, and move heavier artillery closer to the front lines. For the Japanese soldiers entrenched in the jungle, the sight of American tanks and artillery rolling down roads that had previously been considered impossible routes was a devastating blow. The ability to move troops, supplies, and heavy weapons to places previously unreachable by any conventional military force was a game changer. The Japanese had no answer. Where they had once believed they had a natural advantage in terrain, the Americans had turned it into a logistical advantage that allowed them to move not just through jungles, but to crush the Japanese defenses under the weight of continuous, unstoppable supply lines. By the time the Battle of the Philippines took place, the American infantry was no longer just advancing, they were everywhere. They had the ability to strike from unexpected angles, supply forces where the Japanese believed they were isolated, and maintain the relentless pressure that would ultimately drive the Japanese from the Pacific. The roads, once thought impossible, were now an inseparable part of the American war machine. To the Japanese soldiers entrenched in the dense jungles of New Guinea and Guadalcanal, the American engineers and infantry who carved roads through the seemingly impenetrable terrain were almost mythical. They had expected no one could endure the relentless heat, the mud, the constant bombardment from both the environment and enemy artillery. To the Japanese, the jungles were their defense, a natural fortress where even the most skilled soldiers could be trapped. Yet the Americans defied every expectation. U.S. engineers, equipped with little more than basic tools, bulldozers and explosives, went to work relentlessly. They hacked through dense undergrowth with machetes. They waded through waist-deep swamps, often in the face of sniper fire, using shovels, pickaxes, and bare hands to clear a path. American soldiers, conditioned by years of training, knew they had to make progress, no matter how difficult the conditions. These roads weren't just important, they were the lifeblood of the Allied advance, the key to getting men and supplies where they were needed. German and Japanese reports of American progress consistently noted the unnatural ability of U.S. soldiers to work under extreme stress. One captured Japanese officer wrote, "We believed that the jungle was an invincible wall, but the Americans do not know the meaning of stopping. They continue forward despite the heat, despite the dangers, despite their losses." For the men who built the roads, This relentless drive wasn't just about victory. It was about resilience, the ability to keep moving forward, no matter the odds. As one American engineer remarked, "We had to make the jungle our own." And we did. In military history, logistics often remains the unsung hero of warfare. But in the Pacific, American engineers proved that the ability to build roads could be just as devastating a weapon as artillery, tanks, or bombers. The jungles, with all their natural defenses, had become the ultimate barrier to rapid movement. Whoever controlled the road networks would control the pace of battle. The Americans understood this deeply. Every inch of road they constructed through the swamps and mountains of the Pacific allowed tank, artillery, and reinforcements to move faster than the Japanese could react. For the Japanese, each mile gained by American engineers meant an additional front line to defend, a new pathway for U.S. forces to exploit. On Guadalcanal, engineers connected Henderson Field's airstrips with critical supply depots, ensuring that aviation fuel, ammunition, and artillery arrived when needed most. This allowed the Americans to mount sustained attacks on Japanese positions, continuously applying pressure even when their infantry and artillery were far from their initial landings. The roads transformed the tactical balance. What had been a deadly standstill became a relentless American advance. In New Guinea, the causeways and corduroy roads allowed U.S. forces to bypass Japanese strongholds in the interior. What had seemed like an unassailable position in the jungle became a vulnerable point. Once the American engineers constructed pathways that led straight to the heart of Japanese defenses. As the Japanese tried to reinforce their positions or withdraw, American logistics allowed them to outflank these efforts time and time again. The Japanese, confined to narrow trails and with their supply lines cut, were increasingly unable to stop the American advance. The American road networks were fast becoming an unstoppable force that could push deep into the heart of Japanese-held territories. The sheer technical ingenuity demonstrated by American engineers in the Pacific was nothing short of extraordinary. The challenges of constructing roads in swamps, across mountain ridges, and through thick jungle canopy were overwhelming. Yet, U.S. engineers managed to turn these obstacles into opportunities. Where the Japanese saw impossible terrain, American engineers saw opportunity. One of the most iconic feats of engineering was the construction of the Guadalcanal causeways in New Guinea, built by U.S. Army engineers and their Seabee counterparts. The causeways were raised roads constructed entirely of logs, strategically laid down across soft, swampy ground. These roads weren't just functional, they were designed to withstand the weight of tanks and heavy artillery. Wherever the engineers encountered rivers or wide gullies, they didn't back down, they built pontoon bridges. In places where the ground was too soft, they laid down corduroy roads, using layers of logs to create a stable foundation for wheeled vehicles. This innovative approach meant that even in the most challenging environments, the Americans found ways to move their forces forward. The use of bulldozers was another crucial development. With heavy machinery, engineers began to clear entire swaths of jungle, breaking down thick vegetation with precision. These machines weren't just tools, they were symbols of the industrial might of the American war machine. Their ability to turn swamps into highways became a game changer. Through sheer innovation and determination, the Americans were not just building roads, they were paving the way for a revolution in military logistics. The Pacific War was no longer defined solely by battlefields. It was defined by the roads that led to victory. October 1944, Leyte, Philippines. The dense jungles and swamps of Leyte Island were considered impassable by most. By the time U.S. forces launched their invasion on October 20, 1944, Japanese engineers had already entrenched themselves in the thick forest, believing that their positions were secure. After all, the Japanese had constructed fortifications deep in the jungle, relying on the island's natural barriers to hold off the Americans. For weeks, the Japanese had fortified their positions along narrow trails, effectively isolating any potential reinforcement efforts. They believed that no army could maneuver through such terrain at speed. However, what they didn't expect was the relentless ingenuity of the American engineers, especially the Seabees, who had a single mission: break through the natural fortress and provide the U.S. Army with the logistical support they would need to win the war in the Philippines. As American soldiers stormed ashore, the engineers immediately set to work. While infantry battled Japanese forces on the beach, the engineers began clearing paths. They used bulldozers, dynamite, and machetes to clear a path through the dense vegetation. Within 48 hours, they had built a road from the beachhead to key strategic points. By October 22, the road connected critical supply lines, allowing tanks, artillery, and food to be moved quickly from the beaches to the front lines. What stunned the Japanese most was the sheer speed with which the Americans completed the roads. For a force that had never been known for building in such terrain, the Seabees defied expectations. Japanese commanders, who had planned to hold Leyte for months, found themselves under siege by a logistical supply chain that could send reinforcements, heavy weapons, and fuel right to the front within hours. One Japanese officer stationed in Leyte reported, "They built roads faster than we could retreat." In truth, the roads became the turning point of the battle. They allowed the Americans to deploy artillery and tanks that changed the tide of the battle in favor of the U.S. forces. Tanks that were once thought impossible to maneuver in the swampy terrain suddenly found their way onto the battlefield, pushing Japanese positions back, while U.S. infantry gained the upper hand with superior firepower and momentum. By October 23rd, reports came in from the Japanese front lines that infantry forces were being overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of American tanks and mechanized infantry in sectors they thought were too difficult to cross. The Japanese were not simply being outmanned, they were being outsmarted, outpaced, and outsupplied by a force they never believed could move with such speed through the jungle. The Americans had done what was once thought impossible. They had turned the jungle itself into their ally. The Japanese were stunned not just by the speed of American advancement, but by the unprecedented logistical capabilities that had allowed the Americans to conquer the island faster than anyone could have predicted. What had been a seemingly impossible operation to the Japanese was becoming a nightmare for them. In the chaos, Japanese forces attempted to retreat and regroup, but their supply lines were cut off. They couldn't keep pace with the American buildup. Tanks were able to pursue and crush Japanese defenses where they had once believed they could safely withdraw. By the time November 1944 rolled around, U.S. forces were already moving deeper into the Philippines, and Leyte had fallen. The ability to rapidly deploy artillery, tanks, and fresh troops through roads built through impossible terrain was the key factor that changed the balance of the battle. The Americans didn't just win because of firepower, they won because they were able to move like an unstoppable force, their road networks ensuring they could continue to advance without slowing. November 1944, the aftermath of Leyte and the battle for the Philippines. The Japanese were forced to watch in disbelief as their defenses in Leyte crumbled under the unrelenting pressure of American infantry and tanks. The breakthrough that began with Operation King II on October 20th was soon followed by an assault on the heart of the Japanese defense, the fortified positions on Ormoc Valley and the strongholds along the coast. But the key to the American success wasn't just tactical brilliance or overwhelming firepower. It was the supply chain, the roads that allowed continuous reinforcements, tanks, artillery, and ammunition to flood the front lines without interruption. The sheer speed of American logistical operations had caught the Japanese completely off guard. Where once there had been isolated pockets of resistance, now there was a coordinated, relentless push that swept through the Japanese defenses like a tide. Every day, more roads were built, corduroy roads, pontoon bridges, and causeways to carry the heaviest of vehicles and the most important supplies. The Japanese, who had once relied on their difficult terrain to impede any advance, found themselves faced with an American army capable of navigating the very land that had been thought impenetrable. Japanese soldiers, entrenched in their defensive positions, stared in disbelief as U.S. tanks and artillery emerged from what should have been impossible terrain. One Japanese soldier, captured during the battle, described it as a nightmare. "We thought they were stuck. We thought the jungle would keep them away, but they just kept coming. Their tanks, their guns, even their planes, everything was coming through." The turning point had arrived. The Japanese could no longer sustain their positions. Their infantry, already battered from months of fighting, began to break under the weight of U.S. firepower and constant resupply. As their defensive lines crumbled, the Americans pushed further into the Philippines with overwhelming momentum. The psychological effect on the Japanese army was devastating. The U.S. advance had not only broken their defenses, it had shattered their confidence. In just a matter of weeks, Leyte, a key island, fell, and the American supply lines began to expand across the Philippines like a spider's web. For the Japanese soldiers, who had once believed their positions were secure, the experience felt like an encroaching tide of inevitable defeat. They were fighting an enemy that could not be stopped. One Japanese officer wrote in his journal, "It was not the firepower that defeated us. It was the relentless movement of their troops and tanks. We could not stop them because they had the roads. They controlled the flow of men and materials, and that made them unstoppable." By the time December 1944 arrived, the Japanese no longer saw the Americans as mere invaders. They were faced with an enemy whose mechanized infrastructure, roads, supply chains, logistics had transformed the war. Every battle in the Pacific now depended on the ability to maintain those roads. The Japanese were at a loss. They had the firepower, but they could no longer move it efficiently. They had the soldiers, but they could no longer support them for the American forces. The success in Leyte was not simply a victory over the Japanese on the battlefield. It was a testament to their ingenuity and the sheer effectiveness of their logistics system. The engineers, who had built those roads through the most difficult terrain, had changed the course of the war. What had been a long, drawn-out campaign against the jungle was now an unstoppable advance. Operation King II. The campaign that began in October 1944 was the precursor to the eventual American liberation of the Philippines, and a signal that the tide was turning decisively in the Pacific. The Japanese could no longer fight on their terms. The Americans had brought war to the heart of their defenses not through brute force alone, but with the ability to move across terrain they once thought unmovable. The battle for Leyte was over. The road to victory for the Americans, however, was just beginning. By the end of November 1944, the Japanese had suffered a catastrophic blow. The fall of Leyte not only marked the collapse of their defensive lines in the Philippines, but also highlighted a crippling vulnerability in their war strategy. The ability to move, supply, and reinforce their forces in the field had been fatally compromised. In the weeks following the Leyte invasion, the Japanese forces attempted to regroup, hoping to hold other islands in the Philippines. However, the tide had already turned. The American logistical advantage that had allowed their forces to operate with staggering efficiency was no longer just a strength. It had become the primary weapon of war in the Pacific. Every inch of reclaimed land was quickly reinforced with supplies. Every gaining territory was secured by roads that crisscrossed the jungle like veins carrying lifeblood to the front lines. The psychological effect of this constant flow was devastating for the Japanese. Soldiers, once proud of their strongholds, now realized that no matter how hard they fought, the Americans would always be able to reinforce, resupply, and adapt faster than they could disrupt. The perception that their jungle defenses were invulnerable had evaporated, replaced by the unnerving reality of American supply chains, which moved so efficiently that even jungle itself could not stop them. In his final report before fleeing the Philippines, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese commander of the defense in the Philippines, wrote, "We were overwhelmed not by force, but by the speed with which the Americans adapted to our terrain. The jungles we believed were our greatest strength became their greatest opportunity." For American forces, the turning point was clear. The engineers who had built roads across the Philippines proved that the real power of the U.S. Army was not just in its fighting ability, but in its supply and logistics networks. These networks were what allowed American troops to stay on the move, to keep fighting, and to keep the pressure on the Japanese. Unlike the Germans in Normandy or the Soviets in Stalingrad, who had to rely on existing infrastructure and often struggled with disrupted supply lines, the Americans had built their own infrastructure from the ground up. Every road, bridge, and airstrip became part of the American war machine, and the Japanese, unable to respond with anything similar, found themselves at an overwhelming disadvantage. At the Battle of Ormuz Bay, which took place between November 7 to 8, 1944, Japanese forces attempted one final push to stop the American advance. However, the Americans were already there. Tanks, infantry, and artillery moved seamlessly, with all their supplies arriving uninterrupted. In contrast, the Japanese struggled to move their forces through narrow mountain passes, their roads constantly threatened by American air superiority. This disparity was evident in the aftermath of Ormuz Bay. The Japanese 16th Army was unable to regroup and retreat in an organized manner. Their units scattered and disbanded by the constant American airstrikes and ground movement. The American strategy, which had been honed in North Africa and Europe, was now fully operational in the Pacific. Logistics were no longer an afterthought, they were the foundation of victory. By the end of December 1944, the Japanese defenses in the Philippines were broken. The Japanese soldiers, deprived of adequate supply, struggling to move through jungle terrain, were left to fight battles they could no longer win. Meanwhile, the Americans, empowered by their roads, their engineers, and their ability to adapt, had already set their sights on the next objective: the Philippine liberation. The victory in Leyte was not just a military success for the United States. It marked a decisive shift in the Pacific War. With the collapse of Japanese defenses in the Philippines, the Allies began to tighten their grip on the Pacific, moving ever closer to Japan's doorstep. For the Japanese, the consequences of their failure to adapt to the American logistical capabilities were devastating. Strategic collapse. By the end of 1944, the Philippine Islands had become a major strategic hub for the United States. The American logistics system, based on the rapid construction of roads, airstrips, and supply depots, allowed U.S. forces to quickly mobilize and overwhelm the Japanese. The loss of Leyte severely damaged Japanese efforts to mount a coherent defense in the region, as their communication lines were severed and their reinforcement routes obliterated by relentless American bombardment. The psychological blow was immense. Their supply lines are endless. We cannot retreat fast enough. They never stop coming. Despite Japan's efforts to bolster their defenses in the northern Philippines, the American advance was unstoppable. The ability to rapidly build infrastructure behind the front lines allowed U.S. forces to raise supply and reinforce at a pace the Japanese could never match. The Seabees continued their work, creating new roads and airstrips at a speed that left the Japanese unable to adapt. One captured Japanese officer, during his interrogation, explained the shift in Japanese thinking. "We had believed the island's geography would save us, but the Americans have found a way around every obstacle. They bring war to us in places we thought were safe. the inability to adapt. The Japanese failure to adapt to American logistical superiority had profound consequences on their ability to conduct warfare in the Pacific. American engineers had shown that terrain could be conquered, and supply lines could be established even in the most inhospitable conditions. In the Pacific, where every inch of land was contested and resources were scarce, this ability to move, supply, and reinforce rapidly gave the U.S. an irreplaceable advantage. Japanese defensive strategies, which had been built around holding ground, suddenly seemed obsolete. Guerrilla tactics and the ability to move undetected through the jungle had been essential to Japanese operations. However, when faced with an enemy who could move at a relentless pace, even through the densest jungles, their defensive lines began to collapse. The Japanese army, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found it increasingly difficult to defend the islands from this new wave of American offensive power. The Japanese had expected their defensive positions to be the key to survival. Instead, they found themselves facing a foe that could always bring more supplies. More soldiers, more artillery. American engineers built roads that took Japanese defense strategies apart, piece by piece. The legacy of the roads built by American engineers didn't just serve as critical infrastructure during the war, they also became symbols of American industrial might and ingenuity. The Seabees and other engineers showed that logistics could be a force more powerful than any individual battle. The creation of these roads allowed U.S. forces to stay on the offensive, reinforcing and resupplying with a speed and efficiency the Japanese could never hope to match. This unprecedented mobility eventually led to the island-hopping campaigns that culminated in the liberation of the Philippines and the final assault on Japan. The ability to move swiftly and decisively became a hallmark of American strategy in the Pacific. It was no longer just about military might or technological superiority. It was about using logistics as a weapon. By the beginning of 1945, Japan's strategic position had deteriorated beyond repair. The loss of Leyte and the relentless advance of American forces paved the way for the retaking of Manila and set the stage for the final battles in the Pacific. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Japanese were now fighting against not just the might of the American military, but the unrelenting logistical machine that had turned the Pacific into an American-dominated theater. The final years of the Pacific War were a testament to the effectiveness of the American road-building effort. With every foot of road built, the Japanese lost not just territory, but the ability to defend their own land. The Pacific, once an impassable wilderness, had become a highway to victory. The Pacific War was defined by its brutal terrain, its vast distances, and the fierce determination of both sides. But, in the end, it was not the rugged jungles or the miles of endless ocean that decided the conflict. It was the ability to move. The United States' logistical prowess, exemplified in its engineers' ability to carve roads through the thickest jungles and across the most treacherous terrain, proved to be the decisive factor that turned the tide in the Pacific. The Seabees, the U.S. Army engineers, and the troops who followed them understood one simple truth: mobility equals victory. As the Japanese forces dug in deeper in the jungles, relying on what they thought were natural fortifications, the Americans were building their path to victory, one road at a time. The corduroy roads, causeways, and airstrips they created did more than support infantry. They changed the very nature of warfare in the Pacific. In a conflict where supply chains often meant the difference between life and death, American ingenuity and determination ensured that no terrain was too challenging, no barrier insurmountable. While the Japanese soldiers had relied on the jungle as their ally, the Americans learned to make the jungle serve their needs, and in doing so, they disrupted the Japanese strategy, isolated their forces, and ultimately secured the islands. But this victory wasn't just about machinery. It was about the human spirit that drove those engineers to work tirelessly under brutal conditions. It was about the unrelenting drive to move forward, to keep pushing, even when the task seemed impossible. As the Americans advanced through these jungles, they carried more than just supplies. They carried the weight of their national resolve, a belief that nothing would stop them from winning the war. In the end, the American engineers in the Pacific proved that logistics are as powerful as firepower, and that the ability to move across the battlefield can shift the balance of power in a war. The construction of roads through impossible terrain wasn't just a physical achievement. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, persistence, and the will to prevail. By the time the war ended in 1945, the roads built in the jungles of New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and Leyte were no longer just pathways, they were highways to victory, paving the way for the ultimate defeat of Japan. The jungle, once an insurmountable obstacle, had become the road to triumph.